In the videos, you show a lot of, let's say, music and musical gesture which are focused to the violin. So what role has the violin compared to the electronics? Because I found it very interesting that you gave the violin sound and the playing of yourself a very big space. And it was not only kind of overwhelming electronics, it's like you create a certain balance between the live electronics and the acoustic sound.
Well, I'm glad you heard that, Ludger, because I think the starting point for the project was that with a lot of electroacoustic music, it's often very hard to bring together the two sound worlds of electronic music and acoustic. But nevertheless, I think that's one of the most interesting areas for music to explore today. And so the idea was that the violin makes a particular sound, and I think it makes a particular sound partly because of the construction of the instrument, but just as much because of the gestures we use to play the instrument. I mean, we all know that if we're trying to recognize a different sound, say between the piano and the violin, it's actually the attack characteristics that tell us an awful lot about that sound. So then I thought, well, hey, if this is how we're making the sound of the violin, it's with the gestures. Perhaps that's the link I should make to how I make the electronic sound. That I really take my starting point in minute detail with the gestures. And so this is when I developed, I think this is answering your question, this is when I decided to look in quite a lot of detail about the gestures that I use to play the violin. And the violin or the cello or any of the string instruments are quite a useful instrument for this, because the bow has a lot of characteristics that we associate with controlling faders or controlling parameters within a computer via motion capture sensors. Because with a bow we have pressure, we have speed, for example, which are crucial in terms of motion, but they're also crucial in terms of making the sound on a string instrument.
So the gesture is the interface to the sound generators. It's like similar, like you said, like a interface, like a fader or a keyboard or on the piano, a keyboard on the piano. So
Exactly.
gesture is a kind of instrument itself. It's a way to interact with a mechanic organism like the violin, or in this other case, like the computer and the sound the computer is creating.
Yes, actually that's a very, very good way of putting it. I've developed a sort of human gestural controller based around purely musical gestures, because I also wanted to focus on as a musician and as a traditional musician playing the violin or whatever instrument one plays, even if it's a mixing desk, I think since we're very young we develop a very sophisticated mechanism of gestures. So the way we use a bow, we're really extremely aware of this movement. So we have a lot of detail within this movement. So yes, it was to develop a musical interface based on the gestures that we use to play music.
So how would you capture these gestures? So what kind of devices do you have to get data into the computer?
Well, I worked with a composer and engineer called Todor Todorov. He understands, he's very perceptive actually as a computer engineer of how a musician works. And he watched me play and he suggested the series of sensors that I used. We first of all started with accelerometers, because acceleration is a very important musical gesture, both with the right hand. If I want to increase the speed of a note or change the sound of the note, I will often start slowly and go fast, or start fast and go slowly. And also with the left hand, if we think of something like vibrato, this is also to do with acceleration and a very, very important part of the sound. So with vibrato, we often start slowly and get faster as you get more and more expressive. And so accelerometers were where we started. Then we also noticed that circular turning movements were also very important, so we added into this system gyroscopes. And Todor had the very good idea of, with some of the sensors, we combine the data of both the accelerometer and the gyroscope. With some of the sensors, we use it as separate sensors of rotation movements and acceleration. And then another sensor I use, which is very, very simple, is a bend sensor, which dancers and people have been using for many years, which I put, in this case, on my elbow. So again, very much related to the mechanism, to the gestures that we use of playing the instrument. I also have theremins built in to the instrument, 4. 2 of these I use as switches, so I can switch the computer on by touching the violin. That's not a gesture that's completely fixed to the violin, that's just a switch. But I also have 2 other theremins that measure the distance between the point of the theremin receiver and my fingers. So for example, I can, this is very nice, with the amount of string pressure I put on, I can also control a parameter. And within this map, you know, you've been seeing that I've been doing very big gestures and very small gestures. What was crucial to me as well as a composer in this project was finding which sounds work well with large gestures, transforming sounds within the computer I'm talking about, and which sounds work well with small gestures. Because then again, I think we're developing a more sophisticated but also intuitive form of control.
So you have your sensors with you, and could you show how they, how many they are, first of all, and second of all, which of the functions you just mentioned are generated by which sensor? Would you like to explain which controller is having which function?
Yes, very good idea. So first of all, I'm just going to talk about the left hand here. So I was talking about acceleration, for example, on vibrato. So I have one single accelerometer here, and that's this top screen. I don't know if we can see this in the video. So this is, no, sorry, it's left finger, not left hand. So I have a whole selection of parameters and parts of the body I can choose. So with this, I need my accelerometer, left finger, and I can choose axes of X, Y, and Z, or a combination of those. So the direction. So here it's tracking my left-hand finger movement. And of course, it works very well with acceleration. Then in the second column, you can see a lot going on with the gyro, which I wear here on my hand. This is just a connector, so the 2 sensors are here and here. So this will track most of the movements that I do as a violinist. My shifting movements, which is a type of rotation movements, vibrato, which really combines rotation with the gyroscope and the finger movement, and acceleration with those. And it either is an angle that combines these, which I have here, which gives very different, I don't know how I would call this. So I have a certain way of using the gyroscope. That's a very untechnical way to put it. But as a player, where when I'm still, it always goes back to 0. And that's when I have it set on the axis B. But when I have it set on the angle, it's very useful because it's basically, well, it's shifting because I haven't calibrated it. So that when I'm still, it stays at the last position. So that's a very different way of controlling it. So now it's calibrated. You see, when I'm still, there's a little bit of shift, but it's still very usable.
Yeah.
So that's very useful for, say, if I want to do pitch transformation. So I really want it to be there, and I want it to stay on the pitch. Whereas something like here, where it's zeros when I'm still, it's much more useful for, say, a granulation patch. And something like this is also extremely useful for spatialization, which is what we did for the bipolar project, when you invited me to extend this system so I could use the zirconium and the sound dome.
So the last parameter is rather smooth and is not creating so much changing data, while the others have specifica on fast or less fast changing data. And you decide in your preparation how to map which kind of data to which kind of parameter or process.
Exactly, yes.
And you mentioned now the process granulation,
yes,
spatialization,
yes,
And what pitch was the third one?
Pitch, for example, and I also have, in fact, the DSP I still want to develop, but I have something I call elbow resonator, which is a combination of delay, feedback and distortion, and I also have a comb filter within it. So for example, something like a filter is quite good on very fast changing data. So if I put that to the left-hand finger, I'm controlling, if I map it correctly, the output frequency of the filter. So this is it's a very nice shimmering effect that you might add on to, say, vibrato. So then in my piece, I would compose the violin part, knowing that, okay, this note is going to be vibrato, and at the same time, I'm also going to be controlling the filter frequency on that vibrato.
You mentioned an interesting thing, because you say in the composition. So you prepare certain sketches or contexts of pitch you create you play on the violin with probably conventional notation, and then apply a certain process of sound modification to this part. How precise is it possible to reproduce this kind of settings?
Yes, that's a very, very crucial question. What I found is that really my notation is actually the computer presets. So I would spend a long time doing this mapping we were talking about, because I have envelope followers, filters, granulation, and all of that can be controlled either by gestural motion data or by audio, which is a very important part of the compositional system. And then I map all this within my audio matrix. So this is almost like a 3D mixing desk, really. And I have all the parameters within this, my spatialization and all the DSP parameters. And then these are all linked, they're mapped by my presets. And that's really my fixed composition. And you're right, with the basic violin material, I would develop this in notation to a certain extent. But all the refinements I've actually found impossible to notate at this stage. So I really have it by memory. And I find, therefore, because I've always done as much improvisation work as composition work, if not more perhaps, I find that improvisation, within a very refined use of improvisation and quite a limited use of improvisation, is actually the best way to use this technology. I think if I really wanted to expect the technology to do the same thing every time, it would be impossible. But the counter side of that is that because, in a way, the gyroscope, it's giving out 3 messages at the same time. It's a kind of polyphonic gestural controller, which is very important because that's how we use an instrument. We're very polyphonic as musicians. We're doing lots of different things at the same time. So this is nice to reflect that with the technology. And because of that, I found really that I have to more or less memorize the gestures, but it's never that precise. But as long as I've really fine-tuned the preset, I have to make sure that anything will work within that.
So the preset could be either seen, I mean, there are two ways to see it, as a mechanical construction equivalent to the mechanical construction of an instrument.
Yes.
Because this is a prescription of the expected sonoric data which comes out of the instrument, or as a part, especially if it has time critical information, as a part of the composition. It's both at the same time.
Yes, you're right. It is. That's very, yes, I mean, actually you're right. Within this, you're kind of creating for each piece a little instrument within itself.
And there was one thing I was thinking of. If you think of, as you mentioned, the part of how precise you can reproduce first, and second, that you need a certain process of improvisation to find solutions.
Yes.
I think it's somehow not a new way to interact with instruments. Like Chopin created most of his pieces by improvisation, and you can see it in some of the sketches. And then he scored the pitches down to for other peoples to be reproduced.
Yes.
That's probably a critical point because it's very, very complex. Chopin had at least a standardized notation
Yes.
Available to,
Yes.
write it down. For a system like this, you don't have a standardized way of notation. And well, it's probably, the question would be, do you think it's possible at all to reproduce, or is it very much fixed to a musician, an instrument, a space, the microphones, also in a technical environment? What is the actual result of the concert?
There's lots of really interesting points to answer in that statement you just made, Ludger. I'll try to go through them in order because I don't want to miss any of them. So first of all, the improvisation aspect. I think because all this is in real time, so real time means that there's nothing pre-recorded, it's all being produced in the computer or by the musician during the moment of the performance. And how I've worked in developing the software and the DSP, the computer transformation of the violin, or of course it could be any instrument or voice, is that the player is very responsible for responding while playing to what's coming out of the computer. Very much like how you might be playing in a string quartet. You know, a computer note might come out very loud, so therefore you have to respond to that, to give a very basic example. So it's a very highly responsive environment, which is essentially how musicians work, but it means that the person playing it has to become very used to responding and knowing how to respond extremely fast. The second thing is, I think that yes, Chopin's a very good example because I think I've developed this way of working because I am a composer player. Mm-hmm. If I'd been a composer who was fantastic with computers but didn't play an instrument, I would have probably gone about this and asked very different questions and demanded very different musical needs. So I think possibly what's interesting about the system I've used, I hope, is that perhaps I've come up with something a bit different because I'm approaching it very much as a player. The third thing with the notation, the limitation of this system I find at the moment is it's only really me who can play it. And as a composer, of course, I want better violinists to play it or other instruments to play it. So I've been approaching this in two ways. My next commission is actually to write a viola piece with computer or electronic sounds within it. So for this, I'm going to try actually writing the gestures within the notation. My early training was as a dancer, so I know something about dance notations. So I'm going to see if I can develop a gestural notation, because even as a composer, I'm sure you find the same, even when I'm not using computers, I often want to put gestural commands into my notation. Mm-hmm. And the second part of that, which I've just forgotten, yes, the other system that I've been thinking of with the notation is actually to use this as a music generating device and then forget the computer, simply write this down, because I am actually finding it's quite an interesting tool to make a piece. It could be a completely different piece. It could be a piece for trombone or for symphony orchestra. This is actually what I want to talk to them about, this improvising pool in London.
That would be, the computer would have the role of an extension of a certain instrument which can be different.
Yes.
So you could see it as a part of a certain, or would it be like a score attached to the instrument?
Well, what I'm hoping to develop it actually is that I would work on a piece within this environment, and the piece has two results. One result is there's no electronic music. I have written everything down for quite a traditional ensemble to play. Mm-hmm. But then what I would very much like is to have the audience hear the two versions of the piece, or mm-hmm. include that within the piece. And the second idea I have with it is that if I can, of course, when you're working with large ensembles, it's very hard to get time to work with the players individually. But the other idea I had was to take other players from an orchestra, give them the sensors to play with, see how they generate within very strict parameters, because you can't expect very good orchestral players to be good improvisers or know how to use technology, but to work with them for a few hours with specific musical ideas, record the extensions that come out of their instrument. For example, bassoon, I think would be very interesting to do this with, and then develop that into a piece for them to play. Mm-hmm.
On your violin, we saw that you have a little microphone placed there. Is it only there to record the sound which is taken from the strings and then process it, or does this microphone has other functions too?
No, in this case the microphone is simply to take the sound from the violin and put it into the computer. And amplify it if I'm playing live.
So you don't use that audio stream to control anything?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, so this microphone takes the audio into the computer because with the signal processing transformations we've been talking about, I can control them with the sensors, or I can choose to control them with the actual sound of the instrument.
So the sound controls the modification of the sound?
Exactly, with the sound itself, yes. So you can see on the mixing desk, so for example, we can see the sound is going, imagine my voice is the violin or it's the sound producing. So we can see that I'm making sound into the computer, and this is controlling one of the parameters, one of the output parameters in the computer. La, la. Or if it's in this case, it's controlling the output of my granulation. Or I could have exactly that same output controlled by a sensor. So when it's audio, I have all these parameters to play with the sound. So I can choose whether the computer follows the audio exactly as it is now, or whether it follows a sound much more slowly. So for example, I play a note and the gate doesn't close immediately. And you can see examples of that in here. So this same parameter now, I'm controlling with movement. So this is quite an important part of the system in refining how a composer uses this, because again, with some sounds, the actual acoustic volume of the singer or the musical instrument is useful for transforming the sound, and in other processes it's more useful to do the gesture. One thing I noticed very much, you would be very aware of this, is that audio is much harder to control than gesture.
So you mentioned that you use the sound of the violin for the control of certain parameters. How does it work? Do you have an example?
Yes. So within the system, any parameter within the computer, being it the volume of the signal processing devices, the input of those devices, or the way they're transformed, can either be controlled with sensors or with volume. So, for example, if you can see this window here, I've got the top parameter is controlled by a sensor. It's controlled by this finger. See how it's moving. And the next parameter is controlled, you can see it's moving while I'm talking. It's controlled by audio. And you can see it going into the mixing desk here. So if I chose not to use this, I would take all my audio parameters out. And there's quite a difference with how we would control this. With this top window, I hope this is a good one to show, I really have quite refined control with this movement of that fader. But with my voice, you can see it's using the volume of my voice, the envelope, the shape of the volume of my voice, and that's much harder to control. And if I show you with the violin, and here if we go to the so it's a different way of controlling the same thing. And both have their advantages and disadvantages. One way that it's very nice to use the volume to control is I do a lot of things with reverse gates, because often if you're playing an acoustic instrument, it's best to have the transformation or the computer sound actually when that acoustic instrument is playing quieter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is often a problem, I think, in electroacoustic music, is getting the balance. So I have a reverse gate. So for example, when I'm playing loudly, the computer is not working. And as I get quieter and quieter and quieter, the computer gets louder and louder and louder. And this is a very good way to use volume. This is the one example really where I prefer to use the audio sound as opposed to the acoustic sound. Whereas for something like panning or spatialization, when I'm moving the sound between the speakers, this is much better with the gestural controller.
Mm-hmm. So you use these extensions of the sound in conjunction with the sound itself, in conjunction with the instrument, with your gestures, with the computer. So all in all, it is a very complex environment. Would you think at one point you would be able, after having a lot of experience with this system, to create a formalism of notation? Or do you think improvisation is it a stadium inside and getting experience, to getting to know the instrument, and after you know the instrument you can treat it in a different way? Or is it an essential part which will be always important for the creation of a performance?
I think that because this is such an interactive system, and it's interactive on both a gestural and an audio sonic level, that it's highly reactive. And my feeling would be that as soon as we're starting to use notation and a fixed composition, which of course has many advantages for many musical contexts, but it tends to be complex because new music and the human brain and the way we think of sound is very rich and complex. When we start writing this down, the player, I feel, does need to use his or her listening faculties less. I feel that our ears are less open when we're reading a score. And I feel what's very good with this system is that you have to be totally reactive and very fast. And a skill of an improviser, you'll often find that a good improviser is not a good score reader, and vice versa. And the positive thing about improvisation is those players, if they're well trained and very familiar with improvisation, are extremely skillful at being very reactive in the moment of playing. And so I kind of feel that we maximise on the advantages of this sort of system if we can improvise with it.
And what you call reactive is basically that you use your perception, your ear, to judge the result, what you hear, what is the result of your activities.
Yes.
And put it to a certain ideal, or to a certain prove the outcome, the result of what you are listening to what you either intend to have, or if it's something new, you prove it to the interest of the quality of the result.
Yes, while playing.
While playing, yeah. Because I was just thinking, like people like Stockhausen or other composers who work quite a lot with electronics, they have the tendency to create a fixed notation, but as well at the same time they simplify their electronic parts to ring modulation, which is easy to control.
Yes.
Or to a certain device, which is a very standardized device. So and you are expressing with this that the complexity of the system and the flexibility, the options.
Actually, it's the flexibility.
Yeah, the flexibility of this system prohibits somehow, if they want to be used in an interesting way, the fixed notation usage.
Yes, I mean, I would go back to say the model of more like the 17th and 18th century, when sure we had composers, but the performers were very much part of that compositional process and were very important. And I don't think there was such a division between performer and composer. So if we take the typical Bach or back to Monteverdi, the role of continuo players in the way they accompanied the singer, for example. Sure, it was composed, the basic chord structure was given, but those players were really having to improvise within a given framework. And the players become very, very important. And in a way, in this system, I'd like to go back to that idea when the composer really works closely with the players, writing for specific players, and uses the skills of the players and trusts those skills, as opposed to wanting to fix everything within a notated system. Because I do feel that once, as I said, that you notate music, it is harder to listen at the same time.
But you extend with a system like this the area, the field of improvisation, which was harmonic or melodic structures, to timbre, to microstructures, to other parameters like harmonic and melodic qualities. So you could see this as a instrument which is not stable, as a floating instrument. You are playing.
Yes.
And you have one stable part, which is, for example, the violin,
Yes.
and you have another somehow stable part, which is the software environment itself and the controllers.
Yes.
But you have a very flexible part, and that is how the functions of the software are triggered, not triggered, and so on.
Yes, and I think you've highlighted there a very important aspect, Ludger, actually, which I hadn't necessarily thought of myself, in that what hopefully this system should do and what it should allow players working with composers to do is actually play around with those more ephemeral aspects of sound. And the more ephemeral the sound, often the more rich and interesting, but the harder it is to notate. But this type of system is very good at focusing on those more ephemeral areas of sound. So not harmony and strict rhythm, but timbre and density and distortion, purity, filtering. And perhaps this could be a way that improvisation, for the better word, could actually be focusing on those aspects of sound.
Talking more about future, how do you see your pieces? Is your work in context to the notation? Notation is not only a description of how to create or reproduce a sound. It is a way to conserve musical work, musical substance. And if you say it's not notatable, it's not formalizable to some extent, you say it's not. It will not be exist for the future or in the future.
Well, when I say it's not notatable, what I mean is to play this system that I'm using, I wouldn't choose to use notation in order to reproduce it. But I think that I will, and I have already, recorded what I've played with this type of system and then notated it for other people to play, but as a non-electronic piece, or perhaps as a piece with the electronics as a different version of it. Because one does have to think of, I think, three things. I want great players to be able to play this music. It's very boring if only one person can play it. You know, you need the best players you can get. The second thing is the conservation aspect. Absolutely. I mean, I feel that there's something about a musical piece that once it does hit the written page, it has another life. There's also the life of the recording, and I think all these lives are very important. All these versions of keeping the piece. But the third thing is, I think you actually really learn about what you have done and how it can be improved by the struggle to write it down. So therefore, I would still like to go through this struggle. But I don't think that notation is the best way to play it with the electronic version.
It's probably like improvisation from Bach. He wrote down some of his improvisations, but you can imagine that these written down versions are simplifications of his real improvisations.
Yes. Yes.
But they still contain the substance of his ideas.
Yes.
And that's probably what you try to explain now. That
yes, because I think the problem with notation is it is, in its very urtext, or whatever the word is, conservative. I mean, we are building on a system that is hundreds of years old, and we're in a different time now. We're in a different world, a different political state, and notation can't address all those things. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about computers. It really is of our time. So in that way, it's so exciting because it is us today. So we've just got to find ways of making a notation be able to catch up with that, I suppose. But it isn't easy.
Or you can add on one other aspect is which is the interface. The way you learned for a long time, for example, to control this interface of strings and a bow.
Yes.
And you have a certain ability, you developed a certain ability of or complexity of the creation of gestures and musical material. And there's some aspect which I find very interesting. That is, I have to find words to describe it properly, but it's accumulation of knowledge, which is in such cultural activities, like the accumulation of the past generations of the way to handle this interface, to handle these instruments. It's probably not possible to create this degree of mastership in one generation. You need a couple of generations of violinists to build up the knowledge and give it from teacher to pupil. And I think this is one how I understand your music as well when listening and when hearing you talking. That you want to keep this refinement, this complexity of control and sound as well, as one part of our cultural development status, cultural development we have now, and by adding on a new, easy to modify element, you create either a dialectic relationship between both, or you can, what you do probably most of the time, you can feed in the complexity into the system of the computer and use it so that the result is has a quality which is not able to create one without the other.
Yes, because I think there's a reason why humans have used, I take the violin as an example because that's what is in front of us, but musical instruments have developed on a human scale, and this is very useful. I don't think it's surprising that the bow is the same length as a human arm. I mean, I think over centuries, over generations, we've played with this and we've actually developed forms of making sound, forms of instruments that go very well with the human body. And with computers, we don't have this as our initial step. So I feel this is a way of drawing the computers back into the limitations of the physical human body. And I think that limitation can be helpful rather than just a pure limitation. And the other thing that's nice in what you say is that there's a definite feedback loop here, because I've found when I'm using this system that suddenly I'm having to think of the violin in a different way. I'm really having to think of my gestures. And also I'm finding ways of playing the violin that have come about because of what I want to do with the computer, but they're actually making new sounds on the violin. I mean, an obvious one would be things that often work very well are playing extremely slowly. This can have very rich effects with the computer, but also it can produce a nice effect on the violin, which you'd never really think about if you were just playing the violin. So hopefully there's a feedback loop as well into making us think of other, I mean, there's always ways to extend music.
When I found that the coming up century could be considered as a century of or decade of the interface. One reason is, for example, the iPhone or iPod from Apple. It took so much time to find that this means on an interface enlargement.
Yes.
It took so much time to find such a, how you said it, a human, a gesture which is relative close to the human understanding. And that shows a little bit the problems of the computer, that the quality of the interfaces in the computer world are pretty poor.
Yes.
And so you could see the violin somehow not only as a source, as a generator, but as well as an input device together with your controllers, an input device input interface into the computer.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think it's not surprising that, I mean, Apple are one of the best systems of an interface on the computer. Even their laptops work quite well. And they did use artists in their development period. So I think it's this mixture of art and technology is kind of crucial to making things be playable.
Yeah, because artists are reliable on the perception of the people they are doing their artworks for. So musicians as well as painters, as sculptors, and every one of the artists deals with a perception, either acoustic or visual or haptic perception of the people. So they are probably the experts, unconscious experts on interfaces, and I think that could be. Would you think this is a strain of development for the future? And a second question: what role would be would continue the violin or a classical instrument like the violin to have? Will it be at some point unnecessary relic of the historical music, so that it will disappear, or?
I mean, there's 2 points I think to be made here. Certainly, this system of gestural control, I think, can also have applications outside music. I mean, I was talking to architectural software developers, for example. I mean, things that need 3D control, if you like, and they could see this type of interface as being a very useful way to control some of their graphic programs, for example, if that's what you mean as sort of extra musical things. I think with the future of something like the violin or our acoustic musical instruments, will they become redundant? I think there's 2 questions here. The thing is that if you have a physical object to learn on, it's a very good way to learn. And a musical instrument is a physical object. So if we're learning movements as a controller, I think we will always need some kind of physical object, such as a telephone. And one other important thing I think is when we're listening, when we're perceiving music, I'm talking about the audience, it's still quite difficult or put it another way, it's a lot easier for an audience if they can have some insight into how the sound is being produced in order for them to listen to it.
But if I may jump in.
Yes, please do, because I'm a bit lost here.
Yeah, think of using a force feedback device, like on a piano. These things exist already. I've actually in Acre I've played a cello with a bow, with a virtual bow or a force feedback, so that you could feel the vibration of the string through the bow, and the vibrations of the hair and all of this. And it was really amazing how realistically modeled these things were. So if you could imagine that a violin could be modeled by force feedback devices, so that you would have the feeling of an acoustic,
a real instrument,
interaction. But you would have a model. I mean, so a computer model, a computer basically what you are dealing with.
Yes.
So if you continue this idea of
to the end of the
having the necessity of a interaction with a physical device, I would reply, physical devices can be modeled by computers. Do you then still need interaction?
Need them? Yes, yes. I suppose the only reason you would still need them in that case is if you felt that the only way to reproduce a violin sound is actually to have the physical acoustics going on. Because the way wood and strings vibrate in air is completely different to the way they come out of a loudspeaker. But that's where we are now. I mean,
well, that's quite an interesting thing. That is the complexity, for example, of direction,
how we
direction
hear
distribution,
it, yes.
of energy distribution of an instrument. To model that is still unsolved, but you could imagine.
But you can imagine it will come, no?
It will, yeah. And it's basically at the same time, it's the same thing what happened with the Stradivarius. You had to accumulate knowledge about a certain phenomenon until you create a certain machine or whatever, which is able to create this phenomenon or to incarnate the ideal combination of certain phenomena.
Yes.
And you could see a physical model created on the computer at the same time as an accumulation. You need more experience, you need more different mathematics for certain aspects, and at one time you might be able to recreate this, for example, beaming effect of certain frequency in space.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
As well, along with the physical interaction, as long with together with the creation of the sound. Would it be desirable? That would be the final question.
Yes, because I think really most of our developments in technology have come from a need.
Mm-hmm.
So I think basically if there is a need and a resulting function, then we will find it.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't, then we don't need to find it.
One problem will be when will the last Stradivarius will not work anymore. So at
Yes.
that time there will be a need, because it will or for example, like Steinway pianos, the felt of the Steinway pianos is it's not possible to create this quality of 200 years ago, because there is too much toxics and pollution
really?
in the air, so that the quality is not the same as 200 years ago, and it is impossible to recreate it.
Yes.
So certain conditions changed and are not reproducible in current instruments. On the other hand, you could, of course, with a model, you could create other instruments. Either recreate, that would be one need, recreate old conditions.
Yes.
Or the other, create new ideals. I mean, that is what we try to do, you as well, with the computer and together with the violin. New ideals of sound and expression.
Yes. And I think artists are great at searching in many different ways. And they have this wonderful way to move, which isn't necessarily linear. Mm-hmm. And I think we will just explore these, and whatever comes out, I think will produce some sort of richness. I think the important thing is this desire to move somewhere new.